Discover how smarter project insights can lead to better project outcomes.
Hello, project people. Welcome to the Project Chatter podcast, episode 99. We're almost there. It's always great to have you with us. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, follow, like on all your social platforms or YouTube if you prefer, and leave us a message or rating while you're there, because we always love to hear your feedback. Martin, no Mr. Val Matthews today. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. It's good there's no Australians in the room to talk about the cricket, but other than that, it's very good.
Absolutely. We won't go into the sports because we do have a few Englishmen on the call today, and a very exciting episode today as well. I think we're going to get all philosophical today. We have return of two guests, Mr. Paul Goodge and Mr. Warren Beardall. Welcome to you both. I think, Paul, it's your fourth appearance on the Project Chatter podcast. How are you?
Four out of 99. That's a better batting average than a lot of the England cricketers. I'm sorry to hear that Van had to go on a scheduled conflict training course, which meant he couldn't make it. I miss him already.
Fantastic. I don't miss him yet. I don't think Martin does either. So, you know, at least that's one so far out of the four of us. Mr. Warren Beardall, it's your second appearance, I believe, on the Project Chatter podcast. How are you keeping?
It is, yeah. I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, my second innings, 99 not out is probably better than we can hope to replicate. Yeah, absolutely.
Gentlemen, I'm loving the cricket references already. It's fantastic. Let's see if we can keep it going. The analogies to sport is one of my favorite things. But anyway, look, I mean, we need to make a lot of time for this because this can go anywhere, the philosophy of project management. And I don't even know, I mean, Val usually starts by, asking about origin stories and that, but you guys have been on the podcast. We're not going to go there. And we also usually start by asking, to set a baseline on what project management is. But I think that's the entire podcast. And I wonder if we just go straight in there and just say, well, why does project management exist? So I don't know who wants to tackle that one first. I'll go to Paul first, just to kick us off.
Well, I'm going to nudge it into the covers and take a quick single, because I think this arose when Warren and I were talking about something else, but as is our discursive nature, we drifted. And one of the great things, I'm going to big the man up here, because Warren's one of these guys that every time we finish a conversation, I feel a whole lot smarter. And but then I find myself trying to repeat that smartness to other people and find I haven't been paying proper attention, and all I'm doing is parroting what Warren said. So that's my smartness. But we were talking, Warren. I think you initiated this, and I had a very quick gut reaction as ever. And I said, well, we talk about the iron triangle, we talk about time, cost, and quality, but that just sounds too reductive. Because where do we go with that debate? Because it's more than that. But when we start to expand the boundaries, where do we end up? So that's my recollection, Warren. It was you that sort of like initiated this. I thought it was a fascinating subject, and I have been musing on it. But I guess my starting point, Dale, is that is too reductive. We need to go further than that. And I'm sure we'll spiral back into this when a throw comes in from the deep. But I think one of the things that we should kick around is now the thought leadership. Are we seeing enough thought leadership in project management as a discipline compared to some other disciplines? It's not the iron triangle, it's more than that, but how far out do we push those boundary edges?
Yeah, it's interesting because they are like boundaries in a sense, because I think I've previously said that the triple constraint is constraining within itself, because you think it's a constraint, therefore you sort of try and put in a box. And it is definitely an interesting space, but let's bring Warren in as well. Come on, Warren, I know you have plenty on this topic.
Okay, so I mean, you are quite right in terms of trying to set some parameters by which we hold this conversation, but I think I'm immediately going to try and break through those barriers, because I think that in itself is part of the challenge that faces project management going forward, because we have spent a long time, probably since the 1950s, being very clear on what we think a project is, and thereby creating a science around that bounded paradigm. And I'm coming to the conclusion myself that I think that boundary is false, as all boundaries are false. And I've flipped this around. I've actually, I'm no philosophy expert. I only started reading philosophy at the start of the year, but I have been reading a lot of philosophy. And the reason I've been reading a lot of philosophy is because I think a lot of the answers that we're trying to fish around for here are actually parts of much bigger paradigms and problems. And indeed, the constraints that we've been creating within projects are exactly the same concerns and problems that wider science has, and wider humanity disciplines find themselves in. And so perhaps I could sort of flip this slightly for a second and just, let's think about what philosophy is, and then bring it back into project management, rather than saying what is project management and bring philosophy into it. Before we had science, and before we had separate disciplines of mathematics and physics, people just spoke in the context of philosophy, because philosophy is essentially the everything, from the meta to the micro. All of that, if you go back to the early Greek philosophers, the classic three being Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. If you read through their text, or indeed just listen to other people who are giving summaries of their text, a lot of their discussion and revelations are about that journey between the meta, the massive, the everything, and the micro, and then the question is, what is in between, and how do you actually connect all of that together? And it's in that perspectival change that I think we start to get a broader understanding of what it is that we're talking about. And I spoiler alert, sort of one of the things I'm going to be bringing into this a bit later, I think, is a challenge as to whether that perspectival constraint that we put on ourselves, that boundary of what we think a project is in of itself part of the reason that we end up getting into so much trouble in trying to both formulate what we are defining a project as, but also by what measures we're then using to describe its performance. And so the iron triangle, I think, is just an absolutely classic example of that very minutiae-driven thinking around what a project is, because it's only looking at it from the context of the project initiator. But even through the project initiator, is only looking at it through a very myopic lens of getting it done at a preordained cost, which has been, as far as I'm concerned, magicked out the sky more often than not, at a time constraint that is only a constraint because somebody else has brought those constraints in from somewhere else. And by that, we can essentially talk about that as a separate project. And then we're looking at the reality of those two interactions with the efficacy of the performance of the project. And by that, we look at the quality of the output. But in all of those three elements, a triangle, 180 degrees, that is half of a circle. And for me, that is part of the problem. And indeed, it's only two-dimensional. So you've got the iron triangle, turn the triangle inside out, and it's a semicircle. And from that, you can then say, well, let's now look at the other half of that. What's in there? But what is that circle part of? What is it actually sitting around? And turn it into a sphere, and what else is actually going on around it? And at that point, you start to realize, well, no, we're talking about a project, but we're talking about a project in amongst other projects. And so the complexity, the system of systems thinking that, I think you've had a few people on here talking in this way, this is where I think we start to get a much richer discussion about what we are doing, what the analogy is that a project is representing. And once we start challenging those boundaries, we can start having a better conversation. And I think that's probably, Paul, the conversation you and I started having, a couple of months ago. And it's certainly a conversation that, I think, Dale, you've been having on this podcast in lots of different guises, and it may not have been said in that way, but that's what you're doing. You're bringing new perspectives into the dialogue, and by doing so, the dialogue is expanding and enabling a richer understanding of the phenomena that we're actually really talking about, which is change, which is moving from a starting position to an end position, using a framework that we're calling a project to help us get there. And we're then assessing what that was, what it is, and whether that's actually where we wanted to end up. And to me, that is a better start point of trying to understand what a project is.
But in terms of that sort of perspectival shift, as I think you called it there, Warren, so I agree with the system of systems, or we can talk about ecosystem. That's quite a trendy word nowadays.
Gear.
And we need to think, and you talked about the meta as well, and we need to think, I think we need to think about this in terms of, throughout the value chain, because I think sometimes we do, as part of your myopia, we don't think enough about, I think, our responsibility through the value chain. And I think also there's the temporal dimension to it, where we think about things as a moment in time rather than thinking about the duration over a period of time. And I think one of the things also from what you said there is, you talked about the science of project management, or P3M, whatever shorthand we want to use today. And I don't think we reflect enough on the art of it. I think there's a danger that we do take too scientific an approach. And this is not to decry wonderful things such as earned value management, because Martin would give me a very strange look if I started decrying that. But there's the human dimension, which I feel conflicted by, because I hear us talking about it. It's about people that deliver projects. But then I think we kind of shy away from really getting to grips with that. So the art side of the delivery. And that takes some EQ and arguably some SQ as well, spiritual quotient. And I think we're not paying enough attention to that. We're happy going back into our integrated master schedules and doing some sums and some calcs, and possibly going for our checklist of the top 10 reasons why projects fail, and just reinforcing the old paradigm. Because I don't think we're demonstrably better yet. So no. I think you've teed up a whole bunch of things there, Warren. So is this going in the right direction for you, I guess, Dale, Martin?
Any direction is the right direction on this podcast. There's no direction we set. We see where we go, which rabbit holes we find, and there's plenty, as you said, that both you and Warren have opened up there for me, certainly. Let me just comment on a few that popped into mind. So if we had to break those barriers or boundaries as we're talking about, that's great from a disruptive perspective. I feel like, though, a project still does need some sort of framework, but I think what we're getting at is, if my simple brain understands it, is that we don't always set the correct boundaries. And how do we equip ourselves in the profession to, one, diagnose and understand what boundaries we need to set for a specific project? We don't have this tool belt or toolkit we've spoken about before. And, and secondly, it's the application of it. How do we successfully apply it? Because we might go, okay, this is how we're going to operate. This is how we're going to manage this specific type of project. And there's methodologies out there, and there's so many different techniques and tools, etc., that we can go into. But I think if we just keep it at that higher level, it's, how do we set the right constraints? Because, or maybe it's not a constraint. Maybe it's that framework. Maybe that's a better word. Because in my simple mind, the definition of a project is a unique endeavor with a definite start and definite end. And that only talks about the time. It doesn't talk about cost or quality. It just says a unique endeavor with a definite start and definite end.
Okay. But I've got to jump in there, because
absolutely,
I think we are part of the problem.
Yeah.
And why do I say that? It's because I hear your definition, And I think we get awfully attracted to and seduced by that word unique. And there's an awful lot of project management, which is recursive, repetitive stuff. And, you know, that's nuts and bolts of what you have to do. You know, so going back to the artistic craft element of it, I don't know, if you're a successful woodworker, then you probably do a lot of stuff which is just whittling away, you know, before you get to the interesting stuff. And yes, it is a bit dull routine sometimes, but it's a bedrock upon which we do build success. And I think we find that a bit dull sometimes. And we get into a situation where, you know, the thing about our best firefighters or our best arsonists, because if we're just doing that stuff, no one's really noticing us, we're not getting much attention, and we want that. And that kind of detracts from what we should be doing. So I think we have to acknowledge and accept, you know, emotionally as well as intellectually accept that some of this stuff is just routine and we just got to get on with it. So I think that's one thing. I think.
How do we separate the routine from the rest, Paul?
Well, I think my initial reaction to that, Dan, is why are we separating? Aren't they part of the same?
No, sorry, what I mean is how do I identify what should be routine and be applied as something we should do because we've done it before versus actually this is something we should be doing differently?
Well, I mean, Martin's had the misfortune of having spent some time in the same organisation as me. And I would suggest, Martin, that one of the problems that we both witnessed is not just a lack of full adherence to process, yeah, but not even a particular desire to, because that's all kind of really dull, isn't it? If we of all disciplines, I think, as well as any other, should embrace and recognise the role of process. And if we just go back to that thought leadership point that I threw out there a few minutes ago, you know, if we look at our dear friends and colleagues in the quality departments, you know, they've done some stuff around statistical process control and Six Sigma and stuff like that, which, you know, how much have we taken that on board and embraced that and helped us to understand, you know, what its relevance is to our discipline? And I haven't seen much evidence of that. And if that's just my ignorance, then I apologise for it. But I do think there's some sort of what's the word, emotional reaction against adherence to process and being judged against that. That doesn't sound like a sort of like a superhero pants outside your trousers type of thing, which I think attracts a lot of people into project management. I may be doing a great disservice to a bunch of people listening to this, but I do think, well, HR have talked about transition curves and change curves. Now it's coming out of denial, and I think we're right for a discussion around, are we a bit in denial about what our performance levels are, measuring ourselves? Do we really understand why projects fail if they continue to do so? I think that's part of, you know, a starting point for us if we're going to move this forward. I should pause for breath. I should go for a drinks break while a slow left arm spin. Actually, no, a right arm fast bowler comes on at the other end.
No, I think I'm much more the leg breaker. So the conversation has immediately demonstrated part of our problem, I think, simply because we have immediately moved into the assumption that we've correctly bounded what a project is, and that I think has been part of my personal challenge. Certainly over the last couple of years. I mean, I did a master's in project management in 2019, 2020, which was very, very mathematics heavy. And I then took the learnings from that, particularly the mathematical focus of scheduling risk, for example, and took it back into PFI, public-private partnership projects, and started asking, well, why aren't we using this more in this sort of environment? You know, given that it seems to be the perfect place to sort of, you know, throw numbers at bankers. I mean, what could be more obvious? But the reality was nobody else was actually looking at the project in the same way as the project initiator. Everyone else had their own way of defining what they thought the project was. So coming right back to Dale, I mean, I think you offered a definition, And I think to really disrupt this conversation, I'm going to offer a very different definition. And if you've read any of my blog site stuff, you'll recognize this. Now, I'm actually saying that a project is a time-bound intended change. That's it. Because if you coming back to the analogous question that we answered yesterday, Dale, with a Piner, you know, when they're saying how do you bring analogies into projects, and I actually turned that around and said, no, I think that's actually the other way around. You know, the term project, you know, like a lot of our language, most of our language is actually an analogy. You know, we are not physically representing the real world. We are making symbolic best guesses as to what the real world might be. And in exactly the same way, when we're talking about a project, we're just talking about changing something to something else. And nature does that anyway. Animals do that anyway, yeah, but they do it by instinct, or they do it by reaction. They have, you know, the cerebellum, the old brain is part of the mammalian brain that all mammals have, and it enables that automation, you know, that muscle memory. You know, so when Shane Warne was doing all of those magical spins that he used to do, he's not doing that because he's thought about it. He's doing that because he's done it 10,000 times, and it's just a natural thing that he's doing. He's not thinking about it. He's using that automated brain. But what we are as human beings is a brain and an organization around a brain that is able to not think about what we've just received and be a receptor of that information. We are abstractly turning it into something else, because we are then symbolizing it and then enabling ourselves to look forward, to predict, to then have some vision of what we could be moving something towards. And that is intent. You know, there is no other organism on Earth that has intent in the way that we have intent. And our intent is to take nature and turn it to our advantage, to make our survival more likely in its purest form. So it is an intended change. And every time that we move even our thoughts to, oh, well, maybe we can do something in a different way, we are essentially starting a project. We are projecting our ideas into reality. And if we start there in terms of what a project is, and then try and bring all of our project management, artistry and science into that context, we can start challenging ourselves as to say, well, why are we so sure that the APM or the PMI or any of these institutions that is representing a form of management of change, why are we so sure that they have this right in all circumstances? But also, why are we assuming that as individuals, we are walking into a room with a project name in our heads and sitting there imagining the same thing? Because we all know that we're not. And so if we're then starting to challenge all of that, then when we come back to this point of time-bound, intended change, we can then start having conversations that don't start with time, cost, quality. They don't start with resource questions and starting to debate who owns what data. We're simply asking, are we absolutely clear on what that change is that we're trying to instigate? And is the change that I'm trying to instigate as my project the same as the change you're trying to instigate in your project? And this is, you know, and then you can start bringing some of the principles of project management back into play, because that is why it's so important to have clarity on a goal. That is why it's so important to have clarity on a mission statement. That is why it's so important to have priorities, to say we will prioritize that over that. But these are the big picture conversations that we don't really have. And we all assume that we've had them already. And we almost always, at some point, find ourselves constrained by what we think the project is, and then suddenly realize that someone else has a different perspective and is thinking about the project in a different way. So time-bound intended change also enables us to start talking about projects in their widest form. The human project, projects of self-development, projects of improvement, projects of planning, projects of control, projects of prevention. These are all projects. These are all time-bound intended change. So why are we just talking about a project of construction, or why are we just talking about a project of organizational transformation, when in actual fact there is probably a whole series of layers of projects that are going on above and below that momentary change, or that plan change versus the real change. There is so much going on here. This is why complexity, system of systems type thinking, sense making, and bringing some of the non-mathematical and more philosophical, humanistic, logic type ways of establishing all of this, I think actually will help us become better at defining what it is we think we are. And it doesn't start, I think, there is this expression, isn't there, about deductive logic. You can start from the top, you can start from the bottom, but there's this abductive bit in the middle where you sort of then work out from. And I know, Paul, you and I have definitely had these conversations before, and there's nothing new there. I mean, this is why I'm finding philosophy so helpful, because I for lots of different reasons started getting more understanding of what Stoicism is. But from Stoicism, I then found myself starting to read more about what Buddha's teachings were, and he talks about the middle way. So that you start to find this golden thread of what's going on at lots of different levels of both spatial and temporal reality. And at the heart of it all is human beings can intend change. And by that intention, we then have additional responsibilities, but we also have potential to be creating risk that never actually existed. The only reason we have a lot of the risks in these projects is because we're in the middle of them. A lot of these projects wouldn't even happen if we weren't there, because we are trying to control nature temporarily, because nature will win eventually. We can't exist in the universe forever. But so in that meta context, we're only ever doing things in a temporary way. But putting all of that together and then enabling ourselves to have that huge spectrum of perspectival thinking enables us to bring history, anthropology, physics at all levels, all of these different disciplines, which all come from the subject of philosophy. Think about a big jigsaw and just take all of the jigsaw pieces out slightly, but you can still see the picture. What's actually holding all of that together, the glue that is holding that jigsaw together, is philosophy. And every now and again, we pull another piece of the jigsaw out and call it another discipline, and everyone gets specialist in that. But if you don't then put that jigsaw piece back where you found it to work out what it actually represents in the context of everything else, you're actually creating those constraints that are no longer helpful. The constraints that enabled you to be a specialist are now actually constraining you from being a generalist. I think I'll now take a break.
Ron was referring back to a conversation we had about you have inductive and deductive. So you're extrapolating on one and interpolating from the other, and abductive is oscillating between the two, picking up data from sort of both spectrums and seeing how much sense it actually makes, rather than just being high bound to one way of looking at it. And muscle memory. So I think muscle memory and survival instincts we spoke about there. So I think part of our muscle memory is, hey, let's start a project. Now let's have a PID, or whatever we want to call it. Let's have a kickoff meeting. I'm ticking all the boxes so far. And let's say what project success criteria are. And typically it'll be something along the lines of, let me guess, it'll be time, cost and quality, and maybe have some fun as well. And So I think this is where the opportunity arises for us to rather more step up to the plate. And I think we're reasonably good in project management about holding others to account and saying, no, this is your responsibility. No, I'm expecting you to. And we talk, and I think rightly, we talk about project management as being an integrating function, and how enlightened organisations recognise the difference between project management and the management of projects. So it's an enterprise-wide activity. So when a project succeeds or fails, don't just shout at me, because we're all in this together, aren't we? And and we can do the PowerPoint slides to throw around a boardroom or the C-suite, whatever we call it nowadays. But I just wonder, are we doing enough to really get that intellectually and emotionally understood by our sort of peers, our colleagues, and by the organisation as a whole? Because I think part of what Warren's saying here is we ought to have a much more serious and in-depth and analytical and artistic, back to your craft point, discussion about what does success look like for us. Is it just about a survival instinct that gets us through this project? Or is it about understanding the system of systems? Is it understanding the wider ecosystem? Is it understanding what this does for sustainability in all senses of the word? And if we're not really having that discussion, then all we're doing is lurching from one to the other. And that doesn't sound like a very enlightened approach. I fear that's where we're at the moment. I fear we're not having that conversation, because it is a hard conversation, because we're drawing people out of some comfort zones. But the alternative is we keep on with the same levels of performance we've got. We're not making a step change. So that's my fear. Muscle memory, survival instinct are actually preventing us from just stepping back and going, what's a smarter way of doing this? And you referred to PMI and APM there, Warren. I don't see, and again, apologies to people involved as officers or otherwise in those organisations, I don't really see the thought leadership coming through. APM have got a vision of a world where all projects succeed, and I don't have a problem with this like the general thrust behind that, because a world where no child goes hungry and stuff like that. These are all laudable, very, very laudable visions. But what does success look like? And if we don't know what success looks like, if we don't have that broader conversation and don't think about that through the value chain, then I think we're open to all sorts of degrees of failure. And success is a tricky thing. Sydney Opera House, Val's not here, let's talk about it. Is the Sydney Opera House a success? It's a cultural icon that I think most people who are putting shrimps on the barbies are really proud of. But we know the stats behind how long it took and how much it cost. I'm sure we've all reviewed projects, SLAs, where they're all green, but the customer's very happy, and red, where the customer is actually happy, and vice versa. So this success thing is a little bit tricky, and we can't do it in isolation. I think we're in danger of doing that. So we need to reset our muscle memory here. We need to learn how to bowl like Shane Warne did famously to Mike Gatting. If only you'd have thrown him a pie, he wouldn't have missed it. So I think that's part of my contention here, that we're still hidebound by the old paradigms. We're not actively sort of stepping back and putting ourselves to account here and saying, no, are we good enough yet? And I'm part of this. I don't think we are yet.
But I don't think we can necessarily be too critical of the project management community in that alone, because I don't think that is a representation of only project management. I think that is a representation of the entire human endeavor at the moment. The specialism that we have necessitated to have better understanding of all of the disciplines that we are involved in is laudable and is necessary. They are positive constraints. They are necessary constraints to have enabled people to be moving the dial forward in terms of our knowledge, our understanding, our potential for wisdom, and recognizing novelty in applying those into other things. But that is not just project management. That is everything. I mean, physics has not really moved on properly, has it, for nearly 100 years in terms of the findings that are then applicable wider application. The one area that is moving at a pace now is the crossover between neuroscience and psychology, because we've started actually being able to see things and observe things and get sensory data on things that we never used to be able to get sensory data on. So the speculation is now being replaced by observation and theorizing that is actually supportable by evidence. Now that is exciting stuff, but it is, to my way of thinking, that is going to challenge us to our core, because we are going to start actually, rather than speculating on some of this stuff, actually start knowing it, and we're going to start realizing just how fallible we really are. But behind all of that criticism of project management, if you think about the projects of national recovery, projects of national emergency around COVID, these are still representations of our failings as human beings, not our failings as project managers. These are big decisions being made with the wrong level of information, or the wrong level of inquiry, or people asking the wrong questions, or having the wrong motivations in the actions that they're taking. And these are not small issues. These are the challenges of our time. And for me, COVID is the forerunner, the practice, the rehearsal for the global environment pandemic that's now amongst us. Where we're either going to find ways to cooperate and collaborate as a project of 7.8 billion people, or we're not. And those projects need to be defined. And we haven't defined them, because collectively we don't think we can define them.
Well, if the rehearsal for COVID has been climate, then
you think it's the other way around?
We're not doing it terribly well, are we? I mean,
because we're not going to be around to worry about climate change, but we are going to be around to worry about COVID.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point about muscle memory and survival.
It's also perspectival, isn't it? That's when you're me first.
What I heard you say there was, reflecting back on PM, I heard something that's necessary but not sufficient. So you talked about physics, and some bloke called Einstein, who was a bit of a guy, wasn't he? He came up with two grand theories.
Yeah, he was almost right. I mean, fair play to him. Yeah.
It can't be right, because the two theories can't coexist, as we all know. So he came up with these two brilliant ideas at the macro and the micro level. But one of them can't be right, but we haven't worked out which one and why. But that hasn't stopped the world of physics from investigating black holes and wormholes and doing stuff with the Large Hadron Collider and boson Higgs, and understanding the origin of the universe and stuff. And this is perhaps too grand a step to make, but I don't see the world of project management, our discipline, actually starting that endeavour to understand our equivalent of it. I see National Audit Office come up with top 10 lists of reasons projects fail, which look remarkably similar to the ones I've been seeing decades after decade. So, I mean, and that wasn't just a glib comment about, if COVID is the 7.8 billion people project. Now, building on the successes of our 7.5 billion project approach to climate change, then we've got a bit of a wake-up call, haven't we? Because we haven't got it yet.
Well, yeah. How can you call any of those a success when we haven't actually declared what success is going to look like?
Yeah.
I mean, that's back to PMI 101, isn't it? That we're never going to be able to measure success because we don't know what it is.
Some of the failings we're talking about here, is it just due to how we're trained and educated? So at the start of each pod, Dale and Val always talk about how they got into project management, how they got into the space, and 95% of the time they fell into it. They started off as an engineer, a site person, but completely different background to it. And let's say have some of the kind of old guard, probably the wrong phrase, but maybe because they haven't had these philosophical, the kind of educational discussions earlier in their careers, are we just seeing the same results as a result of this. So should we almost be promoting things like project management as a degree to bring in new talent to start having these conversations? Or, you know, but on the flip side, you said it was very mathematical. Is education the solution, or should we be starting off with educating people?
Well, it was mathematical for me. It was mathematical only because my the department that I did my master's through was the mathematics, engineering and computer science department of a university. Other universities do it through their management setup, or they do it through other parts of their organisation. So is education the answer? Well, education is always the answer to some extent, but what education? And my concern with how we educate people at the moment is what we're actually educating them for, and what we're telling them they are being educated for. And this whole idea of qualification, certification to demonstrate capability is convenient. I mean, it's a constraint. It is a set of boundaries that enables a consistency of assessment. But it is only as good as the people who are then actually able to apply that knowledge, rather than just demonstrate that they have bought it or learnt it, or put their resources to work on it. And that is not a criticism of project management. That is a criticism of society. That is what we do. You know, we ask for CVs, and we assess people on the basis of the qualifications in those CVs, and then we whittle it down to the protocols that say who we can and can't select. And some people will do that to the letter, and some people will have an idea in advance who they really wanted and do it in some other way. But none of that gets us any closer to answers here for me. It is again, it is a societal challenge. It is not a project management challenge that we're dealing with here. But what we as project management people can do is at least start considering that in the bigger picture context that it really sits. And rather than beating ourselves up about the fact that projects aren't successful very often, we should be turning around and going, well, no, but collaborations of people aren't actually successful very often. Not in the context of where everybody in that collaboration actually thinks it was a success, because everybody would deem success in a different way. And the only way that you get shared success is to have a shared goal. And rarely, if ever, do we have that. And so those are no longer just questions of project management. Those are questions of societal organisation. And in that context, I think we can have much richer conversations and bring in much wider parts of thinking than simply the discipline of whether you've got certification and know how to interpret a Gantt chart or work through EVM.
So Martin, for me, and I agree, well, education has to be part of the answer here. And we do have university courses that we all know. Leading organisations do have relationships with academic institutions. But I think if we look at the curricula for those courses, they tend to be more of the same, what we've always been doing. Yeah, I don't see much of a thought leadership dimension to it. I think we do have APM, we do have PMI, and I think there's an opportunity for them to take a bit of a lead in this and fund some research into this area. But I think on the wider societal points that Warren's making as well, now, would we not expect, I would expect, so Institute of Directors or CBI, Confederation of British Industry, or other people whose business success is dependent upon their understanding and being able to effectively and efficiently deliver projects, to take some leadership here and say, you know what, there is something here. Now, the ICCPM, the International Centre for Complex Project Management, they came up with a course, which I think was sponsored through QUT, Queensland University of Technology, and that tried to address some of the more sort of the humanistic psychological elements, as well as the system engineering elements associated with complex project management. And they were running that out of Canberra, I think. So I'm aware of that, but I'm not aware of much else that's trying to take it beyond what would be a relatively standard offering of let's understand earned value management, integrated master scheduling, etc. And I think there are broader groupings out there that we and others could lobby and raise interest about. What the return on investment would be. What's the benefit of doing this? Because I don't think it is just a few people talking as we're talking now. I think it needs to be a more concerted effort spread across a wider stakeholder grouping.
Yeah.
Does that help answer the question, Ryan?
Yeah, definitely. It's just about how we move on as an industry and as a group of project management professionals.
Yeah.
Well, I think,
and sorry, Paul, keep going.
I was just going to quickly end up by saying, it's back to the point about getting out of a state of denial. Unless we accept that, and on the change scale, I think the first box, isn't it, the top left-hand box, is about data. It's about information. I think we've got the data and information there. We have major projects through wherever else. We have the national audit reports. We see the data that says typically we're not doing terribly well. We're not doing demonstrably better. And if you think of the investment that's gone into project management in all sorts of ways over the years, has that led to a decent return on that investment? Are we seeing much better performance levels? I don't think we are. So I think the data's there if we want to look at it. Certainly in some of the work that I do, I'm seeing repeated mistakes. So that there is something seems to be intrinsically, as well as perhaps exogenously, stopping us from moving ahead. So let's get out of denial first and say, there's got to be a smarter way of doing this. Let's try and emulate some of the other disciplines and work out what they may be and spend some time on it. What is our version of the Large Hadron Collider? I don't know, but let's go and give it a good kicking around. Sorry, Warren.
And part of that is actually recognizing the dynamics in play here. So we can be talking in frameworks and we can be talking in the context of structures. And I think a lot of the time we are speaking in that sort of vernacular. We're using nouns to explain what we are, and we're using nouns to explain what a project is. But in reality, it is more helpful, I think, to be talking about process and to be talking about what something is and changing to, and what that change looks like and how that change is being orchestrated. And that is a change of language, but it's also a change of perspective that is, coming back to the more philosophical context of what that looks like. A lot of my research, I've been running projects in parallel. I've been looking at my personal development project and my personal recovery project, but I've been looking at that alongside projects of education and projects of research, but also applying some of that to my consulting. And what I'm finding is that bouncing between is actually quite useful. But what is consistent, if you like, what is the common theme to all of them, is thinking about this in the context of the process as opposed to thinking about this in the context of the form. And that, I think, is part of where we're collectively falling over, because thinking in form, coming back to this boundary case, the constraints, that is what actually stops us from being able to acknowledge and recognize. And coming back to Dale, the analogy thing that we were doing yesterday, that is stopping us from using analogies in quite such a supple way at different perspectives of thinking. So why when I'm talking to people about a construction project, am I starting from a completely different mindset to when I'm talking about a project of personal development, or a project of managing a family situation, or managing, anything where you're just trying to sort of take something that is suboptimal to a position where it is more optimal? Why can't we be having that first conversation in the same way? And the only reason is because none of us actually see the perspectival shift that we can make between those. And again, this is why I think language and philosophy and psychology both took to language in the early 20th century and actually realized that language is more than just a medium of communication. It's fundamentally a representation of what we are, in terms of our abstract way of being able to think about things and move that thought into an actionable set of processes. And the fact that we can communicate means that the bound system of the individual, the form of the individual, can turn into a process, a shared process of change, because we can then start to share the symbolism, the abstract association between what is and what could be. And it's starting to understand that has helped me in my research to start saying, well, okay, so this is why now I'm talking about visibility, behavior, and trust as 3 metrics by which you can start working out whether one party and another party in a project are actually doing the same thing. It is why I am redefining a project to be able to bring these other things in, because what I'm trying to do is create a commonality of language, primarily for me, I think, at the moment, but enabling me to then look at the modeling that we are using in psychology, and looking at the modeling that we're using in physics, and looking at the modeling that we're using in management and projects of different types, and saying, well, what can we learn? What can that modeling, what can that schema at that level of understanding of a process represent at a higher level of engagement? And how much can you actually start moving between them? And indeed, are they connected? And are we just not connecting them because we have failed to see the linkages between them? And at some point that gets too complex. So you say, well, okay, we need to simplify it again. We redefine the boundaries and start looking at it again. But in all of those premises, we get a much deeper and better understanding and a much greater opportunity for synergy and analogy between those different systems of systems when we're looking at them in the context of them being a process, not as a form. And so, when you're talking about HS2, you are defined by 7 or 8 layers of engagement of a project. But what HS2 is or should be is a transition. And a transition of what? And that is the core question, I think, that HS2 have had to retrospectively start asking and justifying. What is it we're doing this for? And you've now got that 8 core values as to what they're doing. You look at them and you think, well, yeah, I reckon if you'd started with that, you'd have probably come to a very different set of conclusions, or probably hit more resistance. But you'd have hit more resistance in productive ways because you'd have been able to define what you're doing in better ways. But all of that becomes process. We're moving from there to there, and we're using this as the medium to do that. And when we start talking like that, we're no longer project managers. We're just people. We're just managing change.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about communication, because I personally think that oral communication is one of the most undervalued skills that project managers don't actually consider when they're project managing. They often look at the reports and what do we say against our metrics, and we spoke about measures, and do we have the right measures in place? If I rewind a bit, we talk about how solutions create more problems as well, which is interesting within itself, because as we're saying, according to history, if not worse, we at minimum failing at the same rate. And we're using this excuse, I think, that projects are becoming more complex. But who puts that complexity in? We do. Humans put that complexity in. If you break projects down to, I think, quite simple forms of what you're delivering, it doesn't have to be complex. Contracts bring in complexity. Politics bring in complexity. Profit brings in complexity. So I think it's all artificial from that sense. Whether it's necessary or not, maybe something we want to uncover.
And it is all artificial, Dale, because by definition, all we can do is schematize reality. So everything is artificial. Even what we think we are seeing right now is our artificial re-examination of reality.
What I'm hearing here is lots of echoes of French philosophy. So to that last point, and probably one's doing this very subtly, Baudrillard talks about the simulacra. How do we map reality? And to your point on communication, Dale, I'm hearing echoes of Roland Barthes, who talks about la langue and la parole, the signifier and the signifies. And he talks about, excuse me, the death of the author, the birth of the reader. So meaning, excuse me, meaning doesn't exist until the reader has read the text and given it meaning. Sorry about this, you can edit that out. Hope you can anyway.
But you've also got your, and I sort of had brought in a couple of references there, but and you've excelled at what I was going to say, because I couldn't have been as eloquent in putting some of the sources together on it.
The point about death of the author is that I think, excuse me, we think we're the author too often when the meaning comes from the reader. I think that's part of what I was hearing Dale talk about there. We've got the frameworks, we've got the measures. We're the author of that, but it doesn't really mean anything in isolation, because to your point, Warren, it is a representation, it is a schema. And I think we need to go back to your point, Dale, about the communication and engagement. And I think we're sometimes guilty of a very one-way characterization of that, and not really actively listening. And we talk about it, but how often do we do it? How often, if we sit down with project managers and say, really, what is the perspective of the other stakeholders on this? Too often, in my experience, what we hear is what we'd like to hear. And if you then go and talk to those individuals, you find a very different perspective. And there may be some mediation going on and all that. I accept that. But I think to your point, Dale, it is a very key point. And the point about complex, I mean, again, I think it's back to us trying to be superheroes. It's great if we call something complex, because we're now managers of complex projects. But there's a difference between complex and complicated. And again, we get
Dave Snowden says a lot, doesn't he?
Yeah, we get again seduced by and attracted by, and making it something it isn't. And it's back to that earlier point about there's a bunch of routine and dull routine in this stuff, and that's our job, guys. I think.
But the communication piece there is very much, that is part of the complexity, but it should be part of the complexity, because the whole point of communication is that we're expanding and getting clarity and finding better means to share an understanding and to ratify an understanding. And the failure to communicate is actually the start point of most of what goes wrong with our organizational endeavor, doesn't it? Whether it's within an organizational framework or whether it's in a project framework. I would argue that, by the way, that we have them the wrong way around. Projects are being served by organizations are not being served by projects. But the communication piece is central to all of that. And there are good ways of using the body as an analogy to that, and there are very bad ways of using the body as an analogy to that. And the bad way to do that is to think about an organization or an endeavor as organs of the body. I think if you just focus on the brain and think about the communication in the brain, there is nothing more complex that we do. There is nothing in the world that we do that is more complex than what the brain is doing every moment of every day. The amount of neuron connections in the brain is almost infinitely bigger than the amount of connections that we could be trying to replicate as human beings talking to each other. So there is nothing that we are doing as intended change as human beings that has not been better remedied and better dealt with by nature through the course of development of the brain. And so maybe a better analogy is to be looking at how the brain is actually connecting itself together and understanding how that connectivity and that communication, just as crucially, the breaks in communication that happen, thousands of times a second in the brain, how is that manifesting itself over the development of even a single thought? And my limited understanding of that, because I am doing another master's at the moment in psychology, but it's only 3 months in, my understanding of that complexity now is starting to change the way I'm envisioning a project from start to finish. And it's all about investment of communication up front. The more upfront focus you can put in to challenging the paradigms by which you think you are defining what you're doing, the greater level of integration you are getting of all of those component parts, and the better understanding, the better self-modeling and other modeling that is going on, the schemas that we are sharing and creating and going back to our desks with look much more alike if we have done the upfront effort of communicating and sharing and challenging and debating and facing up to the priorities that don't actually work best for other people. The brain does exactly the same thing. Yeah, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are not quite as separated as I think sort of some leaders to believe these days, but there is a central piece that connects the left and the right hemisphere. And 90% of the job of that central piece is to actually snuff out connections that are going from one to the other, because they're deciding that's not as important as that. They're not and the only way it can do that is because it's done it before. And so these communications are not one-offs, yeah. And one of the expressions is what fires together wires together. So in every brain, those networks look different, but they look different because of the historical way in which things have been connected. And all of those interactions and interrelationships are different structures and forms and processes within the brain, to my mind, are much more healthy as an analogy as to what a project is and what a project potentially isn't. And the complexification of the project is actually the complexification of the communication. And knowing that you've got to put the investment, you've got to make the decision that the time and effort, therefore the cost, the resource allocation, is worth it up front, because eventually you come to a point where some of those connections start working on their own and start almost becoming automated, but they don't become automated on their own. Or if they do become automated, they become automated in ways that you had not envisaged. And so when Shane Warne is doing his leg break, and he's doing it because he's done it 10,000 times, the first time he did that, he did not do that naturally. He had to think about it. He needed communication manners in different parts of his brain. You know, the motor cortex part of his brain was actually quite active then, and was very much communicating with the sensory part of the cortex, which is by no coincidence sitting opposite it. But over time, much more of that starts to become regulated and monitored in the cerebellum, the small brain, the old brain. And that happens over time because communication has happened up front, and that upfront investment has enabled there to necessarily be less communication later, because there's less need, because there's more understanding. And it's only through that upfront communication and upfront interest in making sure that everybody actually understands what is going on, and the implementation of controls that actually ensure that you can keep checking that enables us to be much clearer on the project being potentially successful. And that is, for me, an analogy that starts to actually now work, that you can start to look at the control framework as something that you only start solidifying once you have some certainty over it being fit for the intended change that you are instigating. And just like the brain is plastic and evolves and changes and is reacting to all the chemical changes in the body and everything else that is going on, and at different scales of representation and change and intervention, all of that starts to make much more sense as an analogy to projects when you start thinking about it in the process of control, and the challenge and the necessity to keep coming back and having another look and staying interested. But all of that needs to be sort of done in the context of upfront effort and communication, so that there is clarity on what is going on, and then the communication afterwards starts to become more automated. But it doesn't happen on its own.
So, I mean, to the communication point, one of the things that came to mind when you were talking there, Warren, and you were talking earlier, Dale, there's some African tribe, I think. So if Dan, if you and I are talking, how many people are involved in the conversation? There's 6, because there's me as you see me, there's me as I see me, and there's me as I really am. And likewise for you. So we've suddenly got 6 interacting people or subsets of people. Now we've now got 4 people on this. So no, this is where the complexity comes in, because we've got Martin as etc. etc. So and I think there's validity in that, absolutely. Now we've got various tools and techniques to help us, haven't we? We've got things like Johari window, which talk about the facade and the arena and the blinds and all that stuff. And we've also got things like Belbin, whether we're shapers or monetary evaluators, and we've got MBTI, so are we ENTPs or most likely ISTJs if we're in project management, etc. So we've got these tools, but it takes a couple of things, doesn't it? It takes, one, we've actually got to be prepared for, emotionally prepared for that sort of like investigation and disclosure of who we actually are. But isn't this at the root of what we're talking about? And when we do these away days occasionally, it seems to be a bit of a one-off exercise where we've done it, yeah? And we don't need to revisit it. We don't need to check in with each other and go, well, let's just calibrate it. Oh, we've got new team members. And so I think there's an opportunity. The tools are out there if we really want to embrace them. But I feel we're paying a bit of lip service to that. But
I think Donny McNichol made that same point, actually. So we do some of those things, the Johari window, the MBTI, but on the away day, we always put it last because it's a bit of fun. But if we actually put it up front and we thought about the individual team members, maybe we'll start to actually see the fruition of those relationships.
Yeah.
That's a great point, and Donny really gets his stuff. So no, I certainly bow to his knowledge on this. I agree, and we do seem to do it as a bit of fun. Oh, you're one of them, and I know there's 5 of us who are in this box, and you're in a different one, sort of thing. And you're right, we shouldn't be treating it in such a way. We should be revisiting it. But yeah, I think that's part of what lies at the root, the heart of some of the problems we've got here, personally.
And I think it's a really good crossover point then as well, that all of this trait theory, all of this trait psychology, which in itself is essentially trying to create schemas of people to enable the individual. I mean, it's very dangerous when other people start trying to use other people's schema representations and doing too much with it. In fact, I think it's quite dangerous to be too beholden upon any schema anyway, because by the same notion of constraints, you start actually sort of constraining yourself by and defining yourself by a form as opposed to a process. But there is a lot of use in it, and what those trait theory models are demonstrating is that people are different, but can still be categorized. Not completely, but they can be categorized, and there are then characteristics that are more likely to be relevant to them than they are to you, etc., etc. But why is that any different at scale? Why when we're looking at this same context of dialogue and communication? And I mean, I love that notion of that African tribe. It reminds me of is it Martin Buber who was talking about I and thou? John Vervaeke does a lot of this in his podcasts and series about the meaning crisis, but also his relevance realization. Is a lot of this is about the individual and levels of the individual, of the self and the I, trying to sort of understand itself and seeing itself at deeper and deeper levels. But in exactly the same way, when you're having a conversation with someone else, you're doing the same, and you've got this constant conflict of things that are going on. But what emerges out of that when you have a dialogue that actually goes somewhere is that the dialogue ends up becoming its own thing. Yeah, the outcome of a conversation is different to the outcome if you've been having that thought process on your own. You've been influenced by what has been going on around you. So the thou element, if you like, starts to become that piece in the middle. So no one of us owns this conversation. We've all been directed by each other in terms of where this dialogue has gone, and whether there's anything that comes out of it, I guess, will be for us and others to determine later. But in the here and now, we have created something. We have created a set of ideas and abstract notions of things that we all think we understand to some extent, but no one of us can claim ownership of that because it sits in the middle of us. And in exactly the same way, that's what projects look like. If they're done well, but in that same context, when we're talking about individuals as trait theories, why can't we be talking about projects in the same notions of characteristics, of trait theories, of personalities, of things that they do, things, how they react, how they interact with different parts of themselves? Maybe there's something there. Maybe there's a psychology of projects where you're starting to not talk about the mathematics of the project, but you're talking about, essentially the culture of the project. You're talking about how it behaves. What is the visibility, the behavior, and the trust inherent within that project? And that, to some extent, is what my research is doing. It's sort of challenging whether we're all looking into a project and directing our attention for the good of the project, or whether we're looking at the project and bringing all of the interest of that project to ourselves. And so is the project itself at risk simply because everybody's trying to pull the jam out of the donut to themselves? And it's, that is, I suppose, at the heart of what I'm doing in my research at the moment, is actually challenging whether we can even be talking about a paradigm of a project and be thinking about the risk of a project, when in actual fact, most of the risk is the fact that we're trying to pull a project into our own direction and our own interest.
I'm hearing a bunch of things there. So the points about the schema, I agree completely. The only effective schema for to replace MBTI or whatever else would have 7.8 billion individual elements to it, and that's not going to.
Yeah, the big five is the most scientifically acknowledged, but yeah. The
big five, I don't know if people are aware of. Anyway, we can talk about that. It's well psychologically grounded. But I'm also hearing, and you referred to Buddhism earlier, so I'm hearing something about Zen Buddhism in what you're saying there, Warren. Yeah. And part of that is there is no I, in the sense that the I is constantly evolving and changing. And there's a metaphor, there's an analogy there, isn't there, with project management? No, we tend to crystallize our understanding of the project in a moment in time without realizing it is a constantly evolving, shaping, removing, remodeling beast. And we don't tend to think about it that way. We tend to think about, the one way that we've sort of like envisaged and characterized it.
Well, that's an epiphany moment for me right there, Paul. That's beautiful. I love that. Yeah. So Buddhists say there is no self, and so there is no project.
It's constantly evolving. But the second or third and final thing I heard there was you talking about the dialogue, and what I really heard you saying is about the need for a dialectic. So a dialectic discussion where something new and richer and more powerful comes out of the dialogue, which then reshapes it. And isn't that, again, we've got a metaphor and analogy there also for project management, because as we discuss it and as we communicate, we've been talking about, we get a richer and deeper understanding of this new definition of the project. So I think all too often we have a dialogue, but we don't have a dialectical sort of discourse around it. Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity there as well that then we get hidebound to our beliefs, and how I see me, as opposed to how I really am and how you see me. So I think there are various analogies that we could draw out of this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but no, I love that. I mean, like I say, that revelation of that moment of enlightenment when you.
Enlightenment. There you go. You're now at our hat.
that people strive for and never really get to. An enlightenment is never a moment. It's a way of being, apparently. Not that I've got there. But the whole idea that we're actually striving to fully understand something that is ununderstandable in its entirety. And all we can do is keep sort of moving out into better spheres of understanding by the perspectival change that we're doing. Anyway, I feel like we've just warmed up, but I also feel like we've probably got to close down, yeah?
Well, Warren, Paul, I think that feels like the first innings of a 5-day
Yeah,
test match. And we should
don't
definitely...
Don't forget, in the old days, they used to go for 14, 15 days. So
Exactly.
yeah, let's be careful with that analogy.
Yeah, it wasn't time bound, right? Historically.
That's right, yeah.
You want to declare this innings closed, do you?
No, I think it's probably just the end of day one.
Okay.
You know.
You pull in stumps for bad light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bad light, stop play.
Yeah,
But
unenlightenment, stop play.
Exactly. But we do want to make some time for the feature, because that is a bit of fun. But there's so much that I had written down that I still wanted to go into. I guess just a few comments before. I don't want to open new sort of wormholes, so to speak, but I was just thinking while you're all talking that some of the best project managers that I've worked with are quite entrepreneurial. They adopt, they adapt at pace, they're agile. Yes, they work within the constraints and try and deliver, but they also work outside of the constraints if it helps them. So they don't sort of constrain themselves, and you bring up the brain and the mind, and those are two different things. And how do you apply what the brain's doing? And Paul, you've said it, I think, on our very first podcast with us, that's your most powerful tool in a project is your brain. But then how do you apply it yourself personally as well as collectively? It's a hell of an interesting space. And Warren, I love your time-bound intended change, because it's just another acronym that's easy to remember, TIC. So you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. It's patented by Mr. Warren Beardall there. So time-bound intended.
It's on my website, so it's fine.
There you go. Exactly.
It's in public domain. Yeah.
There you go. But no, I love that definition as well. But as we said, let's make a little bit of time for defend the indefensible. And for this, we'll hand over to Mr. Martin Carriston.
I'm not actually sure what is indefensible after that, to be honest.
I think you've got the hardest part of the whole call here. You need to try and stump us on something we've not thought about yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to quite work after that. But yeah, it was a really good conversation. Really enjoyed it. Definitely need to listen back again. So many references to philosophy. I was kind of frantically Googling some of those while you were talking. So I feel a little bit more enlightened. So thank you for that. Okay, so moving on. Let's start with Warren for your turn on Defend the Indefensible. So you have 30 seconds to defend the following statement. Communication is not important for project delivery. Discuss.
Communication is not important to project delivery because we have already given you clarity on what you need to do, and you just need to get on and do it. There is a clear missive that you're working to, and on that basis, you've got contractual obligations to follow. Just let me know how that goes, and if you haven't got it right at the end, I'll be there to see you. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Definitely heard a few project directors who act like that. Okay, Paul, on to yourself. Your statement to defend is, project management is just about time, cost, and quality. Get that right, the rest takes care of itself. Discuss.
So I don't know quite how this works, so you have to do a bit of editing here. So I haven't heard this one before. So I'm sorry, I haven't heard this segment before, this feature. What am I supposed to argue against it or for it?
For it.
Oh, time cost quality. Okay, look, that is all we need, because I've heard a very enlightened man talk about time-bounded change, and frankly, what is more important in life than time? So let's just understand that. And once we've understood the cost, and when we think about cost, let's not be too narrow. So we've got various elements of cost. So we've got human cost as well as financial cost, and quality. Well, what does quality mean? It's about getting things right, and we have a broad definition of that if we like to think about it. So it's the quality in all we do. It's in the processes, it's in our behaviours. And if we knit all of that together, then what actually lies outside of that, and it's all really down in us having the ability to properly define that, and that should be it. What would lie outside of that, I don't understand.
Brilliant.
Slightly over your 30 seconds, but it is a test match, so we'll allow it. There's no time bound.
Oh yeah, it was a good innings.
It was a great innings. Well done.
I was asking for the balls to be checked first.
Yeah. I mean, he got He got given a new ball, and I think he smacked it out of the park. So
I had a problem with a misshapen ball.
Oh dear, let's not go down that rabbit hole. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure as always, and thank you so much for sharing your insight. As we said, it does feel like the start of, we've just opened a few cans here, and we need to go down these rabbit holes, find these nuggets, whatever analogies we want to use. We need to get you guys back and continue the conversation. But before we let you go, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with, Warren?
Well, I'd just say, if you are in that middle part of your life and you're worried about middle-age spread, contemplate the fact that middle-age spread doesn't have to just be in your belly, it can also be in your brain. So think about expanding your brain and your outlook as well as your waist.
Fantastic. Paul, any final thoughts from you?
One thing that came to mind when I was talking and actually listening to myself was APM with their vision of a world where all projects succeed. And I think a large part of what we've been talking about is we should be leading the thought process that enables a world where all projects succeed. I think that'd be my gift to APM if they saw any value in that. Yeah, I think that's where that's been taking us. Yeah, full stop, period. The bails are off.
Fantastic. Bails off, play stop. Folks, that is all the time we have. There we go. Bad light, stop, play. If you like what you've heard, remember you can pay it forward too by sharing a link to this episode on your social media. A massive thank you once again to our guests today, Paul Goodge and Warren Beardall. It's been so much fun. And thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Martin, it's bye for now.